So YouTube's going as well for anybody that wants to use whatever platform. Cool. Just a few moments here. Just waiting patiently for 12:45. Okay. All right, everybody, welcome back to class. Now that we're 12:45, I'm just going to get things going. And hi, good to see you too, James. I've noticed that sometimes it takes a little while for people to sort of trickle into the meeting. Maybe it has to do with the sort of lunch hour timing or, the calendar or whatever, but not to worry. I'm just going to hold off for a little while then before I ask for the attendance verification. But for the moment, anyway, good to be with everybody here, and I'm hoping you're having a great week so far. So today we have a clear plan. We're just going to finish off the remaining notes on chapter 12, which is all about science. We made a little bit of headway through it on Tuesday, but there's still a little bit more to go through. And so when we finish this, the next thing upcoming is Tuesday, and then you obviously have your Thanksgiving holiday from there. But on Tuesday, it's a key meeting because it is the quiz for this chapter 12 material. And the quiz is just going to be on chapter 12, nothing else. It's all about science. So attendance at these meetings, or at least watching the lectures, reading the book, and taking good notes will put you in, I think, good shape to do well on the quiz. After that, we'll be looking forward to just a couple more things. Don't forget you have a homework assignment that's due by email to me anytime before the end of the day on Sunday the 28th. So basically before the end of Thanksgiving break. Hopefully you've had some time to work on it, or if you haven't, just try not to do it too much at the absolute last minute. But yeah, you just have to find a set of fallacies in advertising, marketing, or media materials, and you'll be able to submit that to me anytime before the 28th. So no rush really yet, but just keeping your head in the game when it comes to the key dates that are coming up. So next week it's Tuesday quiz, and then your third homework is due before the end of that Sunday. And then from there, when we come back from the Thanksgiving break, we just have one more chapter. That's chapter 9, which is about ethics. And we're basically just going to have one more homework assignment at the end and the final exam. So we're getting a little closer to the end of our course, but we still have some important work to do. So, and hi there, Sky, good to see you. And everybody here that I've seen in both live streams. So go ahead and let's get started. I'm just going to review some of the first notes that we talked about on Tuesday, just to kind of build the continuity, and then we'll continue from wherever we left off. So first of all, this is all about science. We started the chapter by just giving the broad definition of science itself, which is the process of reasoning from observable facts to testable explanations for those facts. So the goal of science is to arrive at accurate explanations for things, to be able to explain the occurrence of events, the cause and effect relationships between things in the world or in the universe. So in science, we start by just observing things and noticing what happens. But in science, we don't just stop and say that's what happened. We furthermore want to try and provide an explanation. And the explanations we provide, we hope to be testable. So these are testable explanations for the observed facts. The explanation should be of such a kind that you could perform experiments or tests to verify that they're true. So that's science. Reasoning from observable facts to testable explanations for the facts, starting with observed data and phenomena, and hopefully proceeding to correct explanations for them that could be tested for their accuracy. Okay, after that, we talked a little bit about who are some important figures in the early history of Western science. And we mentioned 2, although there's plenty more we could have also thrown in the mix, but I just went with the book's discussion. So first of all, there was talk of Nicholas Copernicus. This was a Polish astronomer of the 15th and 16th century. And he's well known for kind of, in some views, launching the scientific revolution with his discovery of heliocentrism. So he discovered the heliocentric model of the solar system, as well as Galileo. So he's another figure that I think should also be given credit for that. Using more powerful and newly discovered, newly created telescopes, He was able to accurately observe the motions of the local celestial bodies, the other planets, and the sun, and determined that, in fact, the sun is at the center of our local cosmos instead of the Earth. Before Copernicus and Galileo, it was believed that the Earth was at the center. That's called the geocentric model. So heliocentrism replaces geocentrism. But there was a lot of resistance to the idea because the church was holding fast to the idea that God would have not wanted to place mankind in some peripheral or non-central place. So Galileo was persecuted for his findings and had to recant them publicly under fear of execution by the church. But anyway, Copernicus and Galileo were correct. They've been proven right by much more advanced tools that we have now to absolutely prove the orientation of the different planets in the sun. So Copernicus's discovery of heliocentrism really sort of set the stage for future scientific developments that would veer further and further away from like purely scripture or religious orthodoxy. There's also Sir Francis Bacon, and he's a British man from the 16th and 17th century, and he basically formulated the steps in the scientific method. That's another important contribution to science. The fundamental steps of the scientific method are the core process by which we generate all scientific explanations. It's also the way in which we use science to develop technology, medicines, and the like. So scientific method is important, and it's delivered to us a lot of results, and we can trace a lot of that back to the writings and the work of Sir Francis Bacon in his book Novus Organum, which is written in Latin. Okay, and then we talked, I guess, about what are some different assumptions that are behind science. And hi, Zoe, good to see you too. I guess now that we're a little ways into the meeting, I'll go ahead and ask if you feel like, if you can, please leave a comment, any comment at all, whether it's in the YouTube or the Zoom chat, and then that'll be your record of attendance, just to keep it on the books. Okay, thank you guys. So what I'm saying here is assumptions that are built into science. So one of them is the fundamental assumption of empiricism. That assumption is that most human knowledge does come from the five senses and what we can observe with them. That's a core assumption of science because science does essentially depend on observation of the world, collection of data, and then eventually explanation of those observed facts. So if we didn't think we could get to knowledge through observation and the five senses, then science would really be at a loss, but it does assume that we can do that. Another assumption of science is objectivity, which is the belief that we can study and learn about the universe as it really is, not just how it appears to be, but that we can get to the objective facts and truth about the reality we are in, and that we can do so without bias. Objective is often contrasted with the subjective, and science does not just assume that we're just formulating theories and ideas about our own subjective views, but that we're really able to gain insight into true facts about the objective world. Another assumption of science is materialism, or some call it physicalism, which is the view that everything in the universe is made out of matter and that there's no such thing as a non-physical substance or being. So if that's true, then even your consciousness and your thoughts are just based on physical matter, in particular the brain and its brain waves and neurochemistry. So if materialism is true, then sorry to say there's no soul or afterlife, because there can't be a disembodied consciousness that just somehow floats outside of the physical system of the body. Another assumption of science is predictability. And this is, again, just review of Tuesday. So that's why I'm kind of just zooming through it very quickly. But predictability is the assumption that the universe is orderly and predictable. So once we have identified a causal relationship, like a cause and effect connection, then that same cause-effect relationship would be repeatable permanently into the future. It would always hold. So like, for example, gravity, me dropping a marker from a given height, you predict that it falls. And not just that it would fall the one time, but that it would fall forever if I kept doing this forever, because we think that the laws of gravity are not just temporary laws, but that they're stable, permanent, and that they operate the same way across the whole universe whenever the physical conditions are replicated. Okay, and then one more assumption of science that we discussed was unity, which is the idea that there's an underlying unity to the universe, and because of that, we should eventually be able to acquire a single set of scientific laws that could explain everything from the largest to the smallest scales of reality. It's in belief, it's an assumption, but we haven't quite achieved it yet. Nonetheless, that's one other. We also talked about some limitations that science has, things that are kind of assumed in science but can't be absolutely proven. You could see these as limits. One of them is simply the assumption that the external world exists, which can't be proven beyond all possibility of doubt, because after all, a simulation, if perfectly well orchestrated, would be just like reality is. So science does assume that we are immersed by a real physical environment and it's not all in your head, which can't be totally proven, but I think it's safe to say that most of us aren't worried about that being false. Another limitation, perhaps, of science is that it's only able to study and consider things that are observable. So if there were anything that's not observable, then that would be something that science would never be able to fully comprehend or evaluate. And also, some people find it to be a limit of science, the whole assumption of predictability, because as we were just saying, the assumption there is that natural laws and cause-effect relationships will function the same way forever. But obviously, by definition, the future hasn't happened yet, and all we have is the record of the past all the way up to the present. So I guess it's not absolutely possible to know that these laws of nature will never deviate from the way they've worked in the past at any future time. So it's an assumption, of course, but it can't be proven either. Okay, and then we also close the meeting with some discussion of different views about the relationship of science and religion. Some people say that if science and religion don't agree, and there's many topics that they don't seem to agree on, like the origins of man, the age of the universe or the earth, whether prayer works or not. So if these scientific and religious communities don't agree on these questions, then one view is that science should take priority over religion when they don't agree. That would be the view of a scientific realist who's willing to dismiss religious claims if they don't square with the scientific view. Another alternative view is that religion takes priority over science when these conflicts happen or when these disagreements happen. Another view is that science and religion talk about different topics altogether, and therefore they don't really have any conflict. Maybe science is about physical reality and cause and effect, and religion is about a spiritual, moral side of life and values like that. Of course, it's not so easy to say this because they do at least seem to make claims that are contrary to each other on certain topics where they overlap, like creationism, evolution, age of mankind in comparison to the universe, effectiveness of prayer, and so on. And finally, one more view is that science and religion are actually compatible with one another. Some people hold this view if they're willing to, let's say, modify their interpretation of certain religious doctrines or scriptures so that they fall into alignment with the scientists' results. So you could argue that, okay, well, there's no conflict between evolution and creationism because God is the creator of us, but he uses the process of evolution to do it. Or there's no conflict between the cosmology of science and the Bible because the Bible says everything was created in 7 days, but that's to be taken metaphorically. And therefore, it doesn't really conflict with the scientists' different timeline. Okay, so that's just my quick review of the stuff from last time. Now, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we start by talking about the scientific method a little bit. But before I just fully jump into the steps of the scientific method, I want to talk to you first about similarities between the scientific method and the critical thinking process. And this is also mentioned in the book. Okay. So I'm just trying to copy and paste this thing. For some reason, my keyboard keys give me a problem. Try from the other direction here. Okay. Okay, so just a header for this point. I've drawn a diagram, so you can see it here. On this side, this column, we have the three of the major steps of the scientific method. Now, in a moment, we're going to go through all the steps one by one in more detail. And in fact, there's a full set of 5, but the major 3 are these. So we have observation, we observe the world, and we just see something has happened. The next step after that is to have a hypothesis. The hypothesis is an attempt to explain why the observed event happened. And then we proceed finally to an experiment, which is when you try to test whether the hypothesis is true to see if the experiment will confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. So it's like we observe a fact, we try to generate a hypothesis as to explaining why or how it happened, and then we test that hypothesis in an actual experiment to see if it's confirmed or disconfirmed by the test. Now, I guess I'm showing you already, but you remember the 3 steps of the critical thinking process, everybody? In a perfect world, I guess I would have rather asked you about them first to sort of have a teachable moment. But yeah, critical thinking process, way back to chapter 1, we say that there's experience, interpretation, and analysis. And they're similar in a way to these 3 steps of the scientific method, because in the first step of critical thinking, and just general critical thinking, there's an experience. So you just describe what the experience was or what the event was. But you don't yet try to go further to explain why or how. That's the second step, interpretation. Now you're trying to give an explanation of why or how the experience happened. But in critical thinking, we don't just leave it at that. We go further and we actually analyze, is that the right interpretation or is there a different one that's better? Now, this is similar to the steps of the scientific method because in both cases, we want to explain something. We want to explain either an observed fact or an experienced event. And the second step is either to just give that explanation or to give a hypothesis. A hypothesis is really kind of like an explanation of an event, but it's more rooted in scientific terminology when we use the word hypothesis as opposed to explanation. The third step is also similar because with science, we're trying to evaluate whether this is the right explanation by doing an experiment. And in everyday critical thinking, we try to analyze whether our interpretation was correct or if there's a different one that's better. So observing things, trying to give an explanation for them, and then evaluating the explanation at the end to see if it's right. That's how critical thinking and science overall have some general similarities. So just wanted to mention that. So next, we're going to talk about those precise steps in the scientific method one at a time. So let's go one by one. And so new section of notes, and I'm going to create that heading, and it just says steps in the scientific method. Okay, so here we go. Step 1. The first step of the scientific method is to identify a problem. So one observes the world and identifies an unexplained phenomenon. Okay, so science is all about explaining things. Why do they happen? How do they happen? What causes them? And you obviously have to have something unexplained for science to have a job to do. So there has to be some problem that we want to solve, some phenomena that we would like to generate an explanation for. So that's where you have to start. You got to start somewhere, and the first step is to find some fact or event in the world that's not fully understood. And there's many different examples of things that could serve this case. So I don't know, take the case of people in the past. They notice a volcanic eruption. The mountain is spewing out lava. That's just what happened. That's an event in the world. Notice that at this first step, we don't yet have an explanation. Why is it happening? But science wants to eventually get there, to be able to not just see stuff happening, but to understand why. So a there appear to be lightning bolts discharged in the Earth's atmosphere during a storm. Somebody just sees that happening and doesn't understand why. So we have an unexplained phenomena, and now science has a job to do. It has something that it can explain or try to explain. Here's another case. So since right around the turn of the 21st century, there have been measurable declines in the number of bees in the honeybee population globally. And they seem to really be declining in significant numbers. This has been labeled bee colony collapse disorder. And not everybody knows why that's happening, so that could be another thing. The bees are declining in numbers, problem to be explained. Why is it happening? What's the explanation? So in the first step, we observe the world, and just by using our good powers of observation, we try to identify phenomena that have not been fully explained or not explained at all. Let me read from the book, and you can see how they characterize it. The scientific method begins with the identification of a problem for investigation. This requires good observation skills, an inquisitive mind, and the ability to ask the right questions. For example, in 2006, beekeepers in North America and Europe began noticing that honeybees were disappearing, with some reported losses of as much as 90%. More recently, a string of more than 1,000 earthquakes in Oklahoma prompted a study of a possible relationship between hydraulic fracking for oil and natural gas in these areas. Okay, so first step, hopefully that makes enough sense. Now we move to the second step, which is one of the big ones. Step 2 is to create an initial hypothesis. I'll say it this way: develop an initial hypothesis. Okay, so the second step is where you try to formulate, or you provide an initial educated scientific guess to explain the occurrence of the problem. So okay, so initial hypothesis. The hypothesis is where you're trying to at least have a reasonable guess as to what could be the factor that causes the phenomena you've observed in step 1. We say it's initial because it's tentative at first. It hasn't been proven, it hasn't been tested, so it hasn't been evaluated, but it's just an attempt to try and get the process moving forward by stating a possible explanation. And while we're on the topic, I guess, let me just give the basic definition of hypothesis itself. It's really already kind of a part of the prior definition, but I want to make sure that that's clear. So a hypothesis is an educated scientific guess to explain the occurrence of an event or phenomena. Okay. So let's say, going off of this example just mentioned of the bees, maybe somebody has a hypothesis that changing weather conditions or temperature conditions on the planet Earth caused by human activities has interfered with the life cycle or mating habits of the bees. Maybe another case could be somebody hypothesizes it has to do with the use of novel pesticides that have started to be used in the agricultural industry. Or maybe somebody says, my hypothesis is that it seems to have started right around the beginning of widespread adoption of cell phones, and therefore maybe the establishment of a bunch of cell phone towers has created cell phone tower radiation that is interfering with the life cycle of bees. So whatever the case is, whatever the attempted explanation is, there's a variety of given hypotheses here. Eventually, we're going to get to further steps where we test this hypothesis out, but there's one more step just before that, which is step 3. This is not always mentioned in every description of all the steps of the scientific method, but I guess our textbook wanted to be very comprehensive, so they included this third step, and that is to gather additional info and refine the hypothesis if necessary. Okay, so this third step is based on your initial data collection, you will revise the hypothesis if necessary. So So you see there, this third step, gathering additional info and then making any necessary refinements to the hypothesis. So sometimes based on your initial collection of data that you're doing to try and prepare it for the test of the hypothesis, you might notice that it requires the hypothesis to be edited or altered in certain ways. Maybe sometimes it needs to be narrowed down and made a little more specific, or in other cases, made a little more broad and general. So like as an example, there's a lot of increased rates of teen suicide and depression, more so in this current generation than, let's say, in millennials or Gen X and prior groups that came before Gen Z. So you can ask, why is that happening? That's a problem that has been identified in higher rates of mental health issues, suicide, depression, and so on. So what could be the explanation? Somebody might say, I think it has to do with the rise of social media, which is a much bigger part of the lives of this current generation than people who came before, certainly those that came before the rise of social media itself or even the internet. So somebody's hypothesis is something about social media engagement is creating pressures on people that lead them into greater depression rates. But suppose that as the person starts to gather data on the question, they notice that the statistical correlation between reported rates of higher depression and so on are more with certain kinds of social media sites, but not all. So maybe it's noticed that photo sharing social media apps like Instagram have greater rates of teen mental health issues associated with them than others like Twitter or whatever. So what started off as a more broad hypothesis, social media is causing the teen depression rates, is narrowed and refined down a little bit to certain kinds of them. Another possible example, there have been a lot of, like mass shootings, school shootings, and things like that, gun violence since the late 90s all the way up to the current day. And somebody might say, well, what's the explanation? What's causing all these additional shootings in schools? Maybe somebody says it has to do with video games. This is a hypothesis I don't agree with at all because, violent video games are played everywhere, including in a lot of countries where there's not the same rates of gun violence as we see here. But anyway, just as an example, somebody thinks that it has to do with playing of games. Then they start to study the question and they notice that there's a greater statistical link between documented cases of gun violence and people who played not just video games, but certain genres like first-person shooter games and stuff. So what started off as like gaming is causing more violence gets narrowed and refined down to like specific types of gaming are doing that. Maybe the cell phone tower radiation hypothesis for bees gets narrowed down to like just 5G cell phone tower radiation or something. So once they start collecting data, they notice that that frequency seems to have more of an impact. But at any rate, once you're all done with that refinement of the hypothesis and you've got it narrowed down into its final form, we're ready to move to the fourth critical step. This is one of the big ones, which is test the hypothesis. So let me put that here. So with testing the hypothesis, as you probably can guess, a person just conducts an experiment either in a real world or a laboratory setting, which can confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. So in a real world or perhaps laboratory setting, one conducts an experiment that will either confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis. Okay, so yeah, that's the fourth step. We can't just say, hey, I've got a hypothesis, so now I'm done. We have to place the hypothesis under scrutiny. We have to test it to see if it's actually correct or not. And that's where we reach step 4. So let me ask you guys just to spin your wheels for a minute and give me a little feedback. Suppose that somebody wanted to go ahead and perform an experiment to see whether or not the hypothesis of cell phone tower radiation is the right hypothesis to explain the decline in honeybees, the bee colony collapse. How do you think somebody might test that hypothesis? So their hypothesis they're working on is, I think cell phone tower radiation exposure to the bees causes them to die off in bigger numbers. How could that be tested? Put yourself in the headspace of the experimenter. What would be the way of doing it? I know it takes a moment to either type or just collect your thoughts, but give me something when you're ready. I don't think it's too difficult to say if you just reason about it for a moment. So what do you say? Okay, so Armand, run an experiment where you gather data about bees who are not near or affected by cell phone towers. Yeah, but I mean, what is the gathering of the data? Gabriel, you say this. See if there's anywhere that doesn't have towers and see if they have bees. Okay, so you're talking about real world examples. That's a possibility. You could say, okay, well, like here's a remote rural region where there's no cell phone towers and we have certain bee colonies there. And here's another part, like say, of the country where it's highly industrialized and urban and there's a lot of cell phone towers, and see, how bees do in those two parts. That's possible. How could you do it in a controlled setting? Let's get that one out there. Interesting that both you guys had that same intuition. Usually people go with the controlled setting example first. So now I just kind of want to get that in the chat as well. So that's the real world example I guess you gave. What would be a controlled setting case? Find a dependent and independent variable. That's right, Catherine. So you have to have two groups. One group that's not exposed to the dependent variable and the other that is. So let's take two different colonies of bees, have them isolated from each other, pump one of them full of a bunch of this cell phone tower radiation, like an abundant amount, and leave the other side unaffected by that variable. And then, according to the hypothesis, right, if your hypothesis is accurate, then what should you expect to see in terms of the group that was exposed to the dependent variable of all that cell phone tower radiation? If this is the correct explanation of what causes bee decline, then we should see with respect to that group that they what? Just asking you to sort of finish the thought. You follow me, right? Two groups, one's given radiation, one's not. So yeah, you'd expect the group that's been given more of the radiation to die off. That would be confirmation for your hypothesis. But keep in mind, everybody, that it's not just a given that the hypothesis will be confirmed. You can have a failed hypothesis where the experiment does not verify it. So if, in example, we are pumping one of these groups full of the given radiation frequency and not the other, and there's no measurable difference in their survival rates or whatever, then you would say, that wasn't the right hypothesis, so it didn't seem to be verified by the experiment. So that's not the one to say you publish and report as like an accurate finding. Here's another random example, something from the history of early science. So at one point in time, back in the day, when people saw, like, say, rotten food that had spoiled and maggots had started to like consume it, there were people who actually believed that the existence of the maggots was created by the food itself, that the food somehow like putrefied into these little life forms and that they didn't come from an external source. So they wanted to test whether that's the real explanation for the existence of these little things. So what they would do then is take two separate piles of food, place one within a sealed container, and have the other one exposed to the open air. And according to the hypothesis, right, if food just naturally turns into maggot-like substance on its own, then we should expect that the sealed container, once opened after a given amount of time, will have maggots in it. But that wasn't seen, and so this hypothesis was disconfirmed by the results of the experiment. And of course, we learned that it's passing, pests, bugs, and so on that deposit this larvae. Okay. So good. Now there's one last step, everybody, and it's just the obvious final, which is to evaluate the hypothesis based on the results of the test. So let me get that here. Yeah. Okay, so at the end, you've done your test, and now you're ready to see whether or not it confirmed your hypothesis or not. So if it did, that's good. That means that you can just publish the results and have others in the scientific community attempt to replicate them. But if you didn't get confirmation, then you've got to go back to a certain step. Let me write some of this out, and then I'll ask you another question in a minute here. So the experiment confirmed the hypothesis. Then publish the results for further replication by other scientists. And if the experiment disconfirms the hypothesis, then go back to which step do you think? Question before I just say it. If you have a failed hypothesis, the experiment did not confirm it, to the contrary, it disconfirmed it, then we have to go back to a prior step. Which one do you think? You see them listed out there. So let me know which one you think we've got to go back to in case we got to the end and we didn't get confirmation. Make a new hypothesis. That's right, Gabriel. So it's back to step 2. It's not back to step 1 because the problem is still waiting for an explanation and it hasn't been given an accurate one yet. So it's time to try a different hypothesis and run through the steps again until eventually we get a match between the predicted results of the experiment according to the hypothesis and the actual results of the experiment when the test is done. Now, Alan, you say gather additional info. It's possible that if the results were not way off base, that maybe your hypothesis is still in the running for success and some modifications to it are possible. Yes, I understand that. But if it flat out is disconfirmed by the results, then probably we would generate a whole new hypothesis. So go back to step 2 and repeat the steps. Okay, so now I can paste that in. Okay, 1 second. I have to do it in 2 parts on the YouTube because it has like a character count limit, but that's fine. Okay, there you go. All right, so defined in 2 parts in the YouTube live stream, but in 1 over here on Zoom. So it says, evaluate the hypothesis based on the test results. If the experiment confirms that hypothesis, then that's success. That means maybe you have the right explanation. But even then, there's still a little more work that can be done because what happens is you publish the findings, and then other scientists in the scientific community will take that and try to replicate the findings in their slightly different conditions. And if it keeps getting reconfirmed by multiple different scientists working in different research settings, then that starts to make it appear as though this is the right hypothesis, you know. Now, if it doesn't get confirmed, then as we've said, you've got to go back to a prior step, step 2, generate a new one, and then work through the steps again. One thing I wanted to mention to everybody here is this, that a theory is just a very well-confirmed hypothesis. So like theories start off as hypotheses, and then they can graduate to the status of theory if they've been really, really well replicated and confirmed with no counter instances over time. But even when we have extremely well confirmed hypotheses, in other words, theories, science always, because it's based on induction, still holds open the possibility that new information or different observation in the future can overturn the theory. So science never says like dogmatically, like this is true and there's absolutely no way that it can be false. They always say this is the best well-confirmed theory that is available as of today, and therefore it's our most close approximation to objective truth, but it's still at least within the realm of possibility that it could be revised in the light of different information in the future. Okay, so good. Now, the next thing that we talk about here in chapter 12 is just going over what are some qualities of a good scientific hypothesis or theory. Because not all theories or hypotheses are created equally. Some are better suited to explain the phenomena that they seek to explain than others. And so we would like to know what distinguishes a good one from a bad one, so we, don't find ourselves finding favor with unscientific or discredited theories. So here we go. Qualities of a good scientific hypothesis or theory. Okay, so I'm just creating the header for the next section of the notes then. So we'll start off with relevance to the problem being studied. Okay, so relevance to the problem being studied. The hypothesis must be at least related to the topic that you're trying to research or explain. So okay. Now, this is a very fundamental and basic requirement of a good theory or hypothesis. It has to be at least on topic of the thing that it is trying to explain. And you'd think that'd be obvious, but unfortunately, the world we live in, sometimes people trying to challenge scientific consensus will challenge them based on alternative theories that are totally irrelevant to the phenomena they're trying to explain. Um, I don't know, like for example, there's been a lot more hurricanes in the world with more intensity during hurricane season over the last, say, 20 years. And suppose someone notices that and they're like, well, what's the explanation? Let me create a hypothesis. They look into it and they notice that over the same time period, there's been an increasing number of divorce, like the divorce rate has steadily increased. So they say, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the reason. So more people getting divorced, more hurricanes. Therefore, I think that the divorce rates are causing the hurricanes. Um, I guess it's a hypothesis, at least technically, because it's someone trying to explain something with some other piece of reasoning, but it's totally unrelated. One is about physical forces of nature and how they generate weather, and then the other has to do with social facts about people making up, breaking up in their relationships. But the two things are disconnected. So at a minimum, you have to make sure that the hypothesis is on topic, that it is related to, that it is relevant to the thing that you're trying to explain. Now, more interesting qualities of a good scientific hypothesis come next. The second one is consistency with other well-established theories. So, a good scientific hypothesis or theory will fit in with and not contradict others that have already been well proven. Okay. So basically, think of science, if you will, to use a little visual metaphor. It's kind of almost like a big jigsaw puzzle because all of the parts are supposed to fit together to form a big picture. In science, there's a saying that says, with each new scientific discovery, it's built on the shoulders of giants, or we're standing on the shoulders of giants, meaning that the results of the scientific community from the past serve as the base that we try to build upon when we add new information to that body of knowledge. So it's not supposed to be that with each new generation of science, we completely eliminate the things that came before and start over again. For the most part, we think of it as a body of mutually consistent theories that all fit together. So it's not a very good thing if a scientific hypothesis requires us to abandon or discard other things that we think we've already proven pretty well. Like, for example, and maybe it's a silly example, but got to use something. So say that on Christmas Day, you've got these gifts under the tree, and you're like, how did those get there? So your hypothesis is they've been delivered there by, the mythical gift giver, Santa Claus, who came on his sleigh with reindeer to bring the gifts. Now that's a hypothesis, but it's not very good, because for that to be true, it would really have to overturn a lot of other things that are well established that we think we know. For example, everything we think we know about the functioning and the biology of reindeers would have to be just tossed out, because as far as we can tell, these are well established to be terrestrial mammals, and there's no mechanism that they could use to achieve flight unassisted. So that would violate certain features of biology. Also, aerodynamics, because there's no other mechanism given to propel the sleigh, so it's just utterly magic, right? That would violate all kinds of things we know about what it takes for an object to become airborne. Also, there's something weird going on with the fact that Santa's bag would have to have so much content within it that it's not possible that it could really support the flying sleigh. And how could he circumnavigate the whole globe to deliver presents to each person in a single night? So for the hypothesis of Santa to be correct, it really would require rejection of so many other clearly established principles of science. So it's not a very good hypothesis. In general, this is a quality of a good scientific theory or hypothesis, but it needs to be mentioned that there are some possible exceptions. Like, once in a while, very rare, there can be a revolutionary theory that that does overturn a consensus view in science. But that's the exception rather than the rule. Gabriel, maybe this is what you're talking about. Yes, relativity does contradict quantum mechanics and vice versa on the margins, but the discrepancies between them are not holistic. They're discrepancies, but they still function in largely the same way in most contexts. So that's mentioned in the book. There's a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn who said that there's paradigm shifting possibilities in science, but they're very rare. And for the most part, we do see science as a body of mutually consistent theories. So I guess I was just explaining that point as you made your comment, Gabriel, and it is a fair point to make that with some exceptions, but for the most part, consistency with other well-established theories is a norm, and it's a good thing. I'll read it here in the book. So science is a system of logically consistent hypotheses or theories. Scientific explanations are preferred if they are consistent with well-established theories in the field, what American historian of science Thomas Kuhn referred to as normal science. This system forms a paradigm or a particular way of looking at and explaining the world. So he says, sorry, not he, the editor, Judith Voss, she says, the intelligent design theory, on the other hand, does not meet this criteria because it is inconsistent with the well-established theory of evolution. But they make mention of your point that, however, scientists do not automatically discard explanations if they contradict well-established theories, especially if they meet the other criteria for a good explanation. Einstein's theory of relativity, which stated that time and space are relative, was not compatible with Newtonian physics, in which time and space are fixed and absolute. As it turned out, the theory of relativity, bizarre as it first sounded, turned out to be a better explanation of some phenomena. So while Newton's theory remains a valid predictor at the level of phenomena that we can detect with our normal powers of observation, it fails at extreme conditions, such as those involving the speed of light. So, radical revisions to the scientific status quo are rare, but they can, in fact, happen. Nonetheless, we should be guided by the, if you're playing for odds, the bulk of scientific hypotheses will fall within the consistent framework of other well-proven things. Okay. So good. Let me continue. The next is simplicity, which is also sometimes called by the name of Occam's razor. So the idea of Occam's razor, or perhaps just simplicity, is that if you have two different explanations for one event, so you have like rival explanations, competing explanations for something, the simpler of the two is the one that's likelier to be true. Okay, so Okay. Okay, so then Occam's razor, aka simplicity, is sometimes called Occam's razor because of this medieval philosopher and theologian named William of Occam, and he basically stated this principle, and the name kind of stuck, and it's still a given assumption that is thought to be important for scientific theories. So if you have two different explanations for something, scientists believe that the universe generally has a preference for the simpler of the two. The one that involves fewer additional assumptions and so on is likelier to be actually correct. Um, Maybe this is a silly example, but I'll just use it because I guess it makes sense to me. So, like, suppose that you've parked your car somewhere and you get back to where you parked, and now you notice that the car's not there in the parking spot. So that's a problem. And once that happens, you start to reason a little bit. Using critical thinking or even scientific reasoning. So let's see what could be a hypothesis as to what happened to explain the absence of the car. Can anybody throw out a quick couple of ideas here? Caught towed, that's possible, Armand. Yes, simply that it was parking violations, so it got towed away. Um, Makes sense. Or perhaps another option. Anything else? You might think you're in the wrong parking lot, and so it's just a case of a mistaken location, possibly as well. Maybe it got stolen, another possibility. So I wanted to narrow it down to two. So let me just go with your first option of getting towed. The parking violation, so your car got towed away. Now I'm going to use that, and against it, I'll have another alternative hypothesis. So let's suppose the other option is that aliens came down from outer space and they abducted your car and took it back with them in the spaceship. So now we have two hypotheses, one versus the other. On the one hand, we're thinking it got towed. On the other hand, we're willing to consider maybe it got taken by aliens. Although these are two different hypotheses, one of them is clearly simpler, and I'm sure you can just tell me quickly which one it is that's simpler, that involves fewer assumptions. That just got towed, right. Now let's get into the assumptions of the other one. The other hypothesis is not as simple. It's much more complicated because what other things do you have to assume that you don't know for the alien hypothesis to be correct? You have to make all kinds of additional new assumptions. Um, well, you do know it's a real thing that happens to get towed, right? But the other case, uh, and Sky, I see your contribution that you parked somewhere else, but you've mistaken where. I'm asking about the assumptions, though, that are needed in order to support the alien hypothesis. First of all, you'd have to say aliens are real. Okay, good. Like, we don't exactly know that. So that would have to be a big, bold assumption built into that hypothesis. Not only that they're real, but that they're pretty advanced and intelligent. Because if they're able to come to the planet Earth and mess with your car, well, the closest star to the sun is 4 light years away. So these aliens would not just be like caterpillar type worms on the side of a moon rock somewhere, but they would have to be like highly intelligent and advanced, more advanced than us, because we can't send anything 4 light years away, at least not yet. I think we have the Voyager space shuttle, and that's in interstellar space, but nowhere near another star. Why are they stealing cars, right? Why do they want your car? So we have to assume the existence of intelligent life with the means to transport light years through space to come and get your car of all things. So, I mean, it's a possibility, I suppose, but it's just much more less likely because of all the extra assumptions that are packed into that. So when you have two hypotheses, it's better to go with the one that involves fewer assumptions. Um, and I'll read a little bit from the book on that. If rival hypotheses or explanations satisfy the basic criteria, scientists generally accept the one that is simpler, a principle known as Occam's razor, named for the medieval philosopher William of Occam. The great majority of scientists reject intelligent design theory because, among other reasons, the theory of evolution is simpler than that of intelligent design. The process of evolution can explain through naturally occurring mechanisms, the development of certain organs like the eye. There's no need to add the idea of an intelligent supernatural being to the process. So in general, that's the case. A more simple hypothesis is the preferred hypothesis when we have a couple of them to choose between. I'm trying to think of another example that I had in my mind just now. I don't want to let it go, but let me try and just focus myself and get it. Oh yeah, so like I was going to say this: conspiracy theories, for example, are probably a violation for the most part of the Occam's razor principle, because by definition, a conspiracy theory is usually always set up against an official theory. And I don't know, like take the moon landing, for example. You see the moon landing, and the official theory of it is that it's because people, human beings, built space shuttles that we could take up to the moon and plant the American flag up there, etc. But if a person has a different hypothesis that the existence of these images are due to like studio film recording to disseminate a false narrative, what other assumptions do they have to hold? That, for example, there is a conspiracy to induce false beliefs about the ability of man to travel to the moon, that there must be a motive in concealing the true abilities of mankind's space travel from us, and so many other things too. So in general, we should be a little bit skeptical of many of these conspiracy theories. Not to say that the more complex theories can never be correct, it's possible, but if you're playing for odds, the probability is that it's less likely. That's why we use the word likelier to be correct rather than absolutely must be correct if it's the simpler. Okay, so good. We can move on to the next. Next is the key concept of falsifiability. Okay, now falsifiability. It's interesting to know, but the point is that a good scientific theory or hypothesis is able to be proven false in some way. Good scientific hypothesis is able to be proven false. Now, that might look like a bit of an odd statement at first, because you may be saying, how is that a good thing? I mean, I thought the whole point was to prove that they're true. Um, yes, but falsifiability does not mean that it is false. It does not mean that it will be proven false. It just means that there is some mechanism or method by which you could determine whether it was false. And so if there's no way to check for falsification, then it's not a scientific claim because it can't be tested for truth either. See, when you run an experiment, what you're looking for at the end is to see, was the hypothesis falsified or not? But if you don't even know what you would have to look for to see an instance of falsification, then there's no way to determine whether it was confirmed either, because confirmation means the falsification did not happen. But if it's not even possible to check for falsification, then it's not a scientific claim because it cannot be verified through experiment. So like, for example, this hypothesis about the bees dying from cell phone radiation or whatever, we could say that's falsifiable because if you conduct an experiment that exposes them to that factor and nothing happens to the control group, then that would be a case of falsifying the hypothesis, which is good because if we couldn't falsify it, then we wouldn't even know how to set up an experiment. Einstein's theory of relativity said that we should be able to perceive certain kinds of objects from behind the surface of the moon when there's a lunar eclipse, because his theory of relativity predicted that mass actually, and the gravitational forces of mass, bends light, so that from certain viewing conditions you should be able to see a star which is actually behind the moon, because the light rays should bend around it. And he said if this is not observed when we have another viewing condition of an eclipse to look at it, then that would be falsification of my hypothesis. Now, of course, that wasn't seen, so he gained confirmation, but at least we knew what to examine or look for if it were false. Now, it's problematic and it's unscientific when a so-called hypothesis can't be falsified. Take the case of Sigmund Freud, famous, sometimes called father of modern psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and stuff like that. He had some important contributions to the field, of course, including the development of the idea of the subconscious, which has some validity. But there were also a lot of Freudian ideas that were just the products of a drug-addled mind, a lot of cocaine and stuff, and they've been thoroughly discredited over the years as pseudoscientific. But let me just refer to a few of these. Freud said that little children have all these latent sexual drives and impulses. So he thought like little babies and kids are protosexual. And he thought that basically little boys would have a latent sexual attraction to the mother figure, which would play itself out in later adult life as the boy, if he's heterosexual anyway, would try to seek out a female partner that is in some sense similar to the mother. And with little girls, he thought they had a similar thing, which is the latent sexual attraction to the father figure. He called that the Electra complex. And he says that when little girls, if they're again heterosexual, when they get older, they'll seek out a male partner that is in some way similar to the father. But look, if you say to the Freudian, I don't believe that, what is your evidence? I don't think it's true because I don't feel like I have any even minor sexual attraction to either parent. The Freudian will say, well, you just don't know that you have it because you repressed it into your subconscious mind. So that's why you don't think you have it. But now it seems like there's no way to falsify this claim. Like nothing counts literally as falsification. So it's really unscientific to say that. Another case could be like, say, the horoscopes. Okay, like horoscopes don't give us any mechanism by which to show that they're false. They don't say, if you don't believe it, don't take our word for it. Here, run an experiment. And if this happens, that shows that we were saying something false. No, instead, they say that the predictions are stated in such vague and ambiguous language that anything could be credited as confirmation, but nothing counts as disconfirmation. So you see the astrological chart and it says, here's your prediction. You'll be visited by a friend this week. Okay, and then you're like, wait, that didn't happen. So is that false? And the astrologist will be like, but you're just not observing the facts of your life carefully enough. That little bird that perched on your windowsill last week, that was the friend that we were talking about. So actually, no falsification. But again, if there's no way to do falsification, then there's no way to conduct an experiment. And therefore, it's not even a scientific claim in the first place, because all scientific claims don't just say, take my word for it, and there's no way you can disprove this. They offer you and they invite you to test. And if a test goes a certain way, it should be falsified. So here, let me read from the book on this. Yeah, another case could be like, people talking about the paranormal. So someone's like a ghost hunter, and you tell them, well, what do you mean? I need you to prove to me there's ghosts. And they say, well, they'll never show himself to you because they only show them to people who have faith that they exist. Now, again, we have something that's not falsifiable because you can't give a person that's not already committed to the hypothesis any way to perform a real experiment to establish that it's false or true. Falsification and confirmation are two sides of the same coin. So if you can't falsify it, then there's nothing that counts as confirmation either. And it says that here in the book, a hypothesis or explanation should be presented in a form that is testable and can be replicated. But in addition to being testable, it must be able to be falsified. Philosopher Karl Popper pointed out that no number of positive outcomes can confirm a scientific theory, but a single counterexample is enough to disprove it. Therefore, one of the main tasks of a scientist in testing a hypothesis is the search for falsifying instances. For example, the hypothesis that all swans are white was based on observations of hundreds of thousands of swans, every one of which was white. However, the hypothesis was falsifiable since it would take only one non-white swan to prove it false, which happened when black swans were discovered in Australia. On the other hand, theories that are able to accommodate all challenges have a critical weakness because they can't be tested. For example, Freud's theories about the Oedipus complex fail the falsifiability criteria because if a man says he does not have the complex, Freudians argue that he has repressed it into his unconscious. However, unconscious thoughts by their very nature are not testable, so therefore there's no way to falsify Freud's claim. Okay, and then there's just one more quality of a good scientific hypothesis or theory to end our list with, and that is predictive power. So let me put that here. So predictive power is basically just when a good scientific theory can be used to accurately predict future events. Okay. All right, so one of the major attributes of a good theory is that, and it's kind of cool, science actually sort of gives us ability to predict the future, to tell the future. Because when we have a clear scientific understanding based on a scientific theory, we can use that theory to accurately predict similar things based on the theory that will happen in the future. So here are a few examples. have you guys noticed that whenever there is a lunar or a solar eclipse, that it is reported in the media, and everybody knows exactly what time and date, even sometimes years and years in advance. They'll tell you exactly when it will happen, what time of day, what part of the planet you could be on to have the best viewing conditions for it. And so then when the eclipse actually happens, as predicted by the astronomer, it gives a lot of validity and credibility to that field of science, astronomy, because it's issuing predictions that result in the reality of what was predicted. In fact, there's going to be a big lunar eclipse tonight, one of the longest that we've had in 580 years at 10 p.m. And when this happens tonight, you'll see once again the predictive power of astronomy. Another case could be like meteorology, the science of weather. When the weatherman or woman or whoever gets on TV and says, bring an umbrella tomorrow, 90% chance of rain. Although there's sometimes are exceptions to the accurate predictions, they're generally not just a total guessing game, and they are for the most part accurate. Which means that meteorology, the science of weather that looks at satellite images and etc., it's not just some kind of unfounded body of speculation, but that it's real and that it's factual and that it gets to the truth. Even Einstein, which I was mentioning before, predicted that you should be able to see refracted bent light from behind the lunar surface when there is a lunar eclipse for certain stars, which was then seen. So that is another case of predictive power. So to the extent that theories offer us the ability to make accurate predictions of future events, that enhances the strength and quality of that theory or hypothesis. And it says so here in the book. It says, finally, a good hypothesis or explanation has predictive power and can be used to accurately predict and explain the occurrence of similar events. The greater the predictive power, the more fruitful the hypothesis is. The Big Bang Theory, for example, was able to predict not only that the universe was expanding, but also the amount of helium in the universe and the distribution of the galaxies. It was also able to explain the existence of microwave background radiation throughout the universe, which was first detected in 1965. Einstein's theory of relativity became so widely accepted because of its predictive power. His theory of relativity predicted with greater accuracy certain eclipses than Newton's theory did. Okay, now, so there's just this one last thing to say about chapter 12, and it's not the same part of the notes where we're talking about qualities of a good scientific theory. This is just one last concept, which is pseudoscience. Okay, so pseudoscience, as the book puts it, is a body of explanations that, and this is a sort of in a creative use of language, but that masquerades as science. Body of explanations that masquerades as science. Masquerades is just a term that's referring to like something putting on a mask, concealing, cloaking its real identity, trying to look like something that it is not. And so that's what pseudoscience is. The word pseudo means false. So pseudoscience is like false or fake science. It's something that wants to put on the outside veneer or appearance of being scientific as though it's based on methods and principles that are objective. But it's not scientific because it doesn't involve falsifiability. There's no experiments that are ever conducted to show confirmation for these claims. And a lot of times the claims made by pseudoscience are stated in such vague and ambiguous language that almost anything could be credited as a confirmation of them. And at the same time, they don't allow anything to be claimed as disconfirmation. Now, there are different examples of pseudoscience, many of them that can be named. I can tell you one is astrology. Sorry if you like that stuff, but in a critical thinking class, you're not going to be given any support for it. Astrology is one. Can you think of anything else? Not just astrology, but I throw it over to you. Ghost hunters, good, that's one. Got fortune telling, right? Psychic predictions. Let's get a few more out there. Have you heard of numerology, the study of numbers? Like, ooh, number 13, that's unlucky. That's another case. What else? Tarot cards, you ever heard of that? Look at these cards, they tell you stuff about what's going to happen to you, watch out. Or like, cryptozoologists. Oh yeah, what is that? Like, yeah, the Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster stuff. Yes, that's another case. You guys aren't giving me much. Come on, I only got a couple people saying something. You guys believe in pseudoscience or what? Give me another one. Idea of luck. Well, there is such a thing as chance, I believe. So I don't know, but yeah, I guess I know what you mean. Like, oh, a black cat has crossed my path, bad luck for broke a mirror, I stepped on a crack, these things are bad. Dream interpretations, I don't know about that, Catherine. I mean, we do have dreams, and they seem to be something to do with our cognition and our memories and our inventory of thoughts. But yeah, if a person says your dream definitely means that, I don't know. What is mentalism exactly, Foster? Is it like ESP or something? Like the person thinks they can move things with their mind, or I'm not even sure if I've heard this term, but maybe you have something to say and can let me know if I have the wrong understanding. So like here's one. Some of you might have heard of the prophetic writings of Nostradamus. Like some people, yeah, reading minds, exactly. Yeah, ESP and psychic readings and things like that. That's another clear case. Gabriel, you say spiritualism. I mean, it's stated in a very broad sense. So I don't know if you would maybe want to refine the claim a little bit, but it depends on the example, I guess. Let me read a little of the book. I was just going to mention Nostradamus as a good example of like pseudoscience, because people think he was able to predict all these future events like 9/11, World War II, and French Revolution. But the thing is, if you actually read the words that are claimed to be the predictions, you'd be really, I think, naive and gullible to say that this predicts 9/11. So, fire of the center of the earth shall make an earthquake of the new city. Two great rocks shall long time war against each other, and after that they shall color red the fresh water. I mean, come on. Two rocks, something about war, something about an earthquake, fire, and red water. I mean, it could be claimed as a prediction of any kind of global conflict or major international incident, or just a warlike setting. But despite its lack of scientific legitimacy, as the book says, belief in pseudoscience is widespread. Pseudoscience literally means fake science. To avoid falling for the empty promises of pseudoscience, we need to know how to critically evaluate the claims of pseudoscience using the criteria that we've discussed. And I'll read a little more here from before. It says, pseudoscience is a body of explanations or hypotheses that, in an attempt to gain legitimacy, masquerades as science. However, unlike science, in which explanations are grounded in the scientific method, including systematic observation, reason, and testing, pseudoscience is based on emotional appeal, superstition, and rhetoric. Astrology, psychic healing, numerology, tarot card readings, mind reading, all examples of pseudoscience. While scientific explanations are using precise wording, those of pseudoscience are usually framed in such ambiguous language that it's impossible to determine what would count as verification. Astrological descriptions, for example, are so vague that they apply to anyone. Because of this, pseudoscientific claims are not falsifiable. And for the most part, no tests are carried out to check the validity of pseudoscientific explanations. The few studies that are carried out, such as those on ESP or ghosts, are poorly designed and can't be replicated. Pseudoscience may explain the failure of its explanations to stand up to scientific scrutiny by blaming the subject. For example, it might be said that a person was not healed by the faith healer because he or she did not have enough faith. Yeah, like I saw someone tweeting the other day. It was funny. It was like a kind of humorous thing on Twitter, but someone was like, I stayed up all night to look for Santa and he didn't come, so I know there's no Santa. And then the person was like, haha, well, he only comes when you're asleep. So he is real. He just doesn't come when you're, awake waiting for him. So again, there's no such thing as falsification. Just not even seeing him come doesn't count as falsification. So there's no ability to test for the truth of the statement. Cults, you ask, Kay? I mean, I don't know. It depends on the belief system and the arguments provided in the cult. Sometimes cults just believe like one person has, I don't know, like some kind of like they have some divine connection to God, and that they like are channeling God's words through them, so everyone listens to them. I would argue that that's probably pseudoscientific, but in a way, it's not even claiming to be scientific, because often religion and science are contrasted with each other. And so I don't know if religious claims should even be considered to be quasi-scientific, because they're based on faith and they're not based on observation and testing. So yeah, like the pseudoscience wants to have this like outward appearance of being credible, objective, and based on something, but they do want to take your money. Oh yeah, so like, if you wanted the best astrological predictions, there's a paywall for that. I would ask you to try this. Take a set of astrological predictions and block out the names of the signs and mix them up and ask somebody to tell you which one is theirs. And they'll never be able to do it, because they're all stated in such vague and random language that they could apply to anyone or any circumstance. So guys, that's about all I had for you really on chapter 12. That's all the notes that we had to get through. So we're pretty much good to go for about 10 minutes early. If you need anything between now and Tuesday, you can just let me know. I'm going to post the office hour link, which I always do on Thursdays from 4 to 5 if there's anyone that needs to or wants to come by for any reason. Other than that, though, Tuesday you'll have your quiz, so make sure you're ready to take it on Tuesday. I'm sorry that it's during Thanksgiving week, but that's the date that it falls on. It's Tuesday, so you'll still have plenty of time off after that. But we won't have a lecture class meeting on Tuesday. It's just going to be me mailing you the quiz through Canvas. It's just on Chapter 12, so you should be in good shape, I think, if with your attendance, your notes, and the book. But all right then, guys, thanks so much for everything. I'm going to let you go, so feel free to say goodbye if you want. And I'm going to just close our two streams one at a time, starting with Zoom. So thanks again, everyone. Take it easy, and I hope you have a good weekend and a nice Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Hopefully you get to celebrate and have a nice restful week with your family or whoever else you're spending time with. I'm going to definitely be busy making a lot of food over on my end, so it'll be fun. What about for the test, John? Is there a review for the test? Not really. It's just the meetings themselves. So you should be able to, I think, watch the videos, take good notes, and you should be in good shape. But like, for example, know about the steps of the scientific method, know about the qualities of a good scientific hypothesis, know about the different views about the relation of science and religion. Let's see, and know about the similarities between science and critical thinking process, and what are some of those assumptions behind science, as well as maybe knowing some info about some of the early important figures of science like Copernicus and Sir Francis Bacon. Okay, then, thanks again, everyone. Take it easy, and I'll be in touch. So have a good one. And see you soon, guys. All right, all the YouTubers, take it easy. And next time, I'll see you guys after we get back from Thanksgiving. Okay, bye-bye.